which is really just a beautiful little letter in so many ways. And the more you learn about who the Philippians were and the history of that church, I think the more beautiful this letter gets. And I hope tonight to touch on some of that in a way that will hopefully be helpful to you. Let's go ahead and dive in just a little bit and look at Philippi and where it's located. Now, you may recall that Paul first encounters the Philippians in the 16th chapter of the book of Acts. And Paul is on his second missionary journey, and he, up to that point, has gone over a lot of the same territory that he covered in his first missionary journey, traveling through Asia Minor. But then he sees a vision of a Macedonian man asking him to come over and help them, which is a vision from the Lord. And so he crosses over the Aegean Sea and comes into the port of Neapolis, which was really just the port for the city of Philippi. And he proceeds to Philippi, and that's the first time he preaches the gospel on European soil. And so he begins to preach to the Philippians. And let's talk a few minutes about who these Philippian people were that he encountered. We're going all the way back almost 400 years before Christ. The settlement that became Philippi was established, as best we can tell, by some colonists from the island of Thasos, which is out in the Aegean Sea. And they came and they set up a settlement at the foot of Mount Orbilos. And there were several strategic reasons why they would set up a settlement here. Number one, there was, even back in those days, an important trade route that ran east to west across the Greek peninsula. And it came through a pass that came right down into what became the city of Philippi. And so there was a trade route there that was important. Secondly, there were some very fruitful gold and silver mines that were located in the area. And as a consequence, Philippi not only became a wealthy city by virtue of the mining operations, but when Philip of Macedon took it over, he made it the site of a mint where he printed coinage in gold and silver. And so they established this settlement sometime around 360 or so BCE, and then just a few short years later, Philip II of Macedon comes in and conquers it. The people who had established it, as I said, they were from the island of Thasos, but they were Thracian people. They were of the Thracian persuasion, and Philip conquered the Thracians and thereby conquered this little town, and he called it Philippi after himself. And then that's how it got the name. As I said, he established his mint. Now, I say that it was on the route that became the Via Egnatia. Now, it didn't become the Via Egnatia for a few hundred years. But the Via Egnatia was the major Roman road that ran east to west, basically along that trade route. And by virtue of the Romans claiming it and paving it and making it a major Roman thoroughfare, they ensured that Philippi would remain an important city, because it's essentially the gateway between this mountain pass and the port of Neapolis. Okay? So you have this major road, you have this mountain, you have mines, and the Romans conquered in 168. What they don't do is make Philippi the major city of Macedonia, of the Roman province of Macedonia. They make Amphipolis the major city, the capital city of the Roman province, just a little bit inland from Philippi. All right, everything's going just fine until 44 BCE, and Julius Caesar is assassinated. And you will recall that his assassination sparked a civil war. On the one hand, you had Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's nephew and heir. And on the other hand, you had Brutus and Cassius and those who had conspired to assassinate Caesar. And this civil war goes on until, I believe it was 42? Yeah, 42, when the final battle of that war is fought in Philippi. And Octavian and Mark Antony, of course, win that war. And as a consequence, they put a lot of, I guess you might say, sentimental value on Philippi as the site of their victory. And when Octavian comes to power as Augustus Caesar, he continues to pay close attention to Philippi. He takes a lot of the soldiers who had been important in helping him win the victory there when they retire, and he puts them there to colonize that area. He makes it an important seat of Roman government. But now the interesting thing about Philippi is, unlike a lot of the cities we've talked about, things like Corinth, for example, it really wasn't a major commercial city, ever. So you didn't have a lot of goods being bought and sold there. What it was a seat of government and a place where gold and silver was mined, which of course was very important to government. And so the Romans had a very special interest in Philippi, and they caused this city to take on a very Roman character. Now think about this. By the time Paul comes there in the 50s CE, you have this city that is steeped in Macedonian lore. It's actually named after one of the great heroes of Macedonian lore and the father of Alexander the Great. Okay? And then it has been possessed and treasured, pardon the pun, by the Romans for 100 years. And it has this sort of mishmash quality of being a mixture of Macedonian Greek and Roman culture. The more you study about Greek culture, the more you begin to see that there was a bit of a cultural distinction between the Macedonian Greeks and the Greeks farther south in the Greek peninsula. And that's not too hard to wrap your mind around. For example, I grew up in eastern Alabama. My dad's people were from South Georgia. I mean, about 45 minutes from the Florida state line, South Georgia. My mama's people were from Montgomery, Alabama, except her dad's people were from Middle Tennessee. We're all as southern as you come. But it was like three totally different cultures visiting the different groups. My mom's mother's people in Montgomery were very urbane, but it was a certain type of southern urbane. My mom's dad's people from Middle Tennessee were just good as gold, good old country farming people, but it was a different southern to grandma's people. And then when we went to visit dad's folks in deep South Georgia, that was an entirely different thing. And here you are right here in the South, and you've got three very different cultures. Well, Greece was sort of like that. You had the Macedonian Greeks, then you had the Greeks in and around Athens. That was a different culture. Then you had the Greeks over around Corinth. That's a different culture altogether. And then you go a little farther to Sparta. That's an entirely different culture. All Greek, but very different. Okay? Macedonian Greeks were sort of characterized by being very open and frank in the way that they dealt with life. They didn't see themselves as being very esoteric the way the Athenians did, for example. They didn't think they were smarter than you. They were just very open and frank and honest. They were known to be very warm people, very accepting, but very disciplined people. Well, now that turn of mind meshed very well with the Roman culture, especially the Roman military culture. And that's sort of what developed in Philippi. And so the Romans put a military government in place, and it thrived and flourished there in Philippi because those two cultures were very compatible with one another. So by the time Paul comes there, that's the sort of culture that he finds. Now, we'll talk more about Paul's visit there in just a second. But I want to notice that it was governed by a pair of Roman military officers who were called the duumviri. Duo for two, and then viri for leaders. And so you had these two who were over the city. The Romans always sort of had a mistrust of putting a single person in power. They did it a few times, and it led to the Caesars. But early on, especially in Roman government, they never wanted one person to have all the power. And so this is pretty characteristic. Interestingly enough, when Paul gets in trouble in Philippi, he's brought before, depending on your translation, the praetors or the chief governors. But notice in Acts 16 that it is plural. And that's perfectly in keeping with what we know of Philippian culture. It would have always been led by a pair of Roman military governors. Well, as we said, Paul first visits there on the second missionary journey around 4950 CE. He visits at least twice more that we'll see in chapter 20 of the book of Acts, around 56, 57. And then the letter to the Philippians is written from Rome later on, 61 to 62. Let's talk a little bit about Paul's visits first, and then we'll get into the letter itself. Acts chapter 16, Paul goes to the city. The first few verses of chapter 16 are taken up with Paul's vision of the Macedonian and the traveling to get to Philippi. Once he gets there, he lands at the port of Neapolis. He proceeds, verse 12, to the city of Philippi, and he goes to a place of prayer. Do y'all remember this? Where was the place of prayer in Philippi? It was outside the city gates by a river. Now, does that strike anyone as odd in terms of Paul's normal pattern of how he deals with a new city? What did he normally do?
Synagogue.
Yeah, he went to the synagogue in any new city. Why didn't he go to the synagogue in Philippi? There wasn't one, as far as we can tell. There weren't very many Jews there. Reason probably being because the Jews outside of Palestine tended, especially around the Roman Empire, to congregate in places where there was a lot of commerce. That's what they tended to do well in. Business, buying and selling goods, lending money, things of that nature. There just wasn't a whole lot of commerce in Philippi. It was very much a government-oriented city. And so there apparently were only a few Jews in the area, and they went down to the river as a place of prayer rather than having an actual synagogue. Well, that's the first place Paul goes, and he makes the first convert in Philippi there down by the river. All right. What happens next? Do you remember this? Luke says, as we were going down to the river, there was a slave girl who was following us. Remember this? And she's crying out, these men are the voice of God Almighty giving you the way to salvation. And Luke sort of summarizes this and says she did that for many days until Paul became, New American Standard says, extremely annoyed. And he cast a spirit out of her that was giving her the ability to do these things. Now, what happens after that?
Her masters.
There's more to the story than just the girl who's demon-possessed and able to prophesy, right? She's a slave girl, and her masters were making a profit by utilizing this ability. And when the spirit was gone, they lost their opportunity for profit. So what do? They take Paul and Silas now before the praetors, before the governors. And they accuse him not only of having taken away their method of profit, but they also accuse him of preaching a doctrine which is unlawful for us as Romans to follow. Now that's interesting because, for one thing, that's really early for there to be a systematic Roman opposition to Christianity, unless the reference is to Claudius having driven the Jews out of the city of Rome. And that even seems a bit obtuse to me. So I think this is one of those things that, based on what information we have now available to us, we're going to have to say we'll have to get to heaven to find out the whole story on that and understand what exactly are they referring to by saying that it was unlawful for them as Romans to believe what Paul was preaching. The only other thing I can think of is that by this time the Caesars were pretty well established, and the concept, Nero already being Caesar, of treating the Caesar himself as a god is in place. And maybe they're saying Paul preaching that there's only one God and it's not Caesar is contrary to Roman law. Even that seems a little bit of a stretch, but hey, if you're looking for something to get somebody in trouble for, well, stretching things is kind of the norm. So what happens? What do the praetors do? Y'all know this story. What do? They beat them with rods, which was the typical Roman fashion, and cast them into prison. Anybody see a problem with that?
Without a trial.
What's that?
Without a trial.
Without a trial. And Paul and Silas are Roman citizens. They are entitled to a trial. And they didn't get one. They just got beaten and thrown into prison as if they were just non-Romans. Well, of which there were plenty, by the way. Paul and Silas will make a point of this later on in the story. Okay, but they get thrown into this prison. You remember the earthquake, which ultimately results in the conversion of the Philippian jailer and his family. And as a consequence, the Philippian church begins. Now, Paul doesn't get to stay and work with them very long, because the next morning, the praetors send someone down into the prison and say, let them go. We've done enough to them. And Paul says, I ain't going nowhere. I'm a Roman citizen, and you beat me and imprisoned me without a trial. And they say, well, you've been commanded to be released. And he says, well, have the praetors come get me themselves. Pretty plucky thing to do, but he's a Roman citizen, and he has the absolute right to stand on his rights, and he does. Well, the praetors want him out of town. Why? Well, he makes them look bad. And if word gets back to Rome, and by the way, they were appointed directly from Rome. This was no local election that put them into power. They were appointed directly from Rome. And if word gets back to Rome that they've abused a Roman citizen without trial and imprisoned him, well, they're on the hot seat. So the best thing that Paul can do is get out of town before this gets around. That's very, very different from what Paul runs into almost everywhere else he goes. Almost everywhere else he goes to the synagogue, he preaches to the Jews, he makes half of them mad, half of them believe him. The half that are mad want to stir up trouble. They persecute him until they get the city governors involved. Sooner or later, Paul gets beaten, run out of town, stoned, whatever happens in that particular city. But it's almost always the Jews who are stirring things up. It just doesn't happen that way in Philippi. And there's a very good reason for that. There just wasn't much of a population of Jews in Philippi. And so there we have Paul in Philippi, and he has to leave pretty quickly and doesn't get to do much with the church. Now, he goes essentially south, heading down toward Achaia, Athens, ultimately into Corinth, and all of these sorts of places. But he goes to Thessalonica and Berea on his way. Now, when we get to the 4th chapter of the letter to the Philippians, Paul is going to make mention of the fact that while he's in Thessalonica, these Philippian Christians sent 2 contributions to help him along his way in his mission work. Now, that's interesting to me. Because, number one, there can't have been very many of these Philippian Christians. You're talking about a time period measured in weeks from the time that Paul was preaching to them, and really only the household of the Philippian jailer, Lydia and her household, and potentially the slave girl who was freed, are the only converts that are mentioned in Acts 16. So there can't have been very many Philippian Christians. Even if these were very evangelistic, it would take time to build up much of a church. And there hasn't been a very long period of time, but they're generous enough that they send not 1 but 2 contributions to Paul while he's in Thessalonica. Now, this is just part of their character, and we're going to see this in a moment. But they are very generous Christians. Now, when we get back around to chapter 20, Paul is now on the 3rd missionary journey, and he goes from Ephesus to Macedonia. Luke doesn't specify what cities he visited in Macedonia, but it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't have visited Philippi. And so he goes through Macedonia. On the way back, he sails out of Macedonia, which would have been the port of Neapolis, but Luke specifies that they were in Macedonia. But what's interesting to me is, after Acts chapter 16, Luke never uses the word we or any first person pronouns until Paul comes back to Macedonia in chapter 20. And then it becomes we again. From 16, or the end of 16 until the middle of 20, Luke is reporting what Paul is doing and some of Paul's companions, and it's always he and they, but it's never we, which I think lends itself to the inference that Luke may have stayed behind to work with the Philippian Christians. And maybe Luke was an integral part of the work in Philippi. Maybe even Luke had gone back to visit Philippi at some time later. It's interesting to me that when Paul writes the letter to the Philippians, if you read the address, never skip the addresses. All right, the opening verses and the closing verses, don't skip those. They're full of information. Paul doesn't say Paul and Timothy and Luke. He just says Paul and Timothy to the Philippians. And at the end, when he's sending his final greetings, he doesn't send any greetings from Luke, which tells us that Luke clearly was not with Paul when he's writing this letter. I don't know where he was, but he often would write greetings from Luke if Luke was with him when he wrote the letter. I'm just curious. I want to know more about this, but I have this sort of pet theory that Luke may have spent a considerable amount of time with the church in Philippi and maybe some of the other churches in the area and helped them to get off the ground, which might explain why they seem doctrinally much farther along than, for example, Thessalonica or even Corinth, where Paul spent a good bit more time by the time Paul writes this letter. All right. Again, in chapter 20, he returns, verse 6, to Philippi, and from there sails to Troy or Troas, where he waits 7 days and then meets with the brethren on the first day of the week. Okay? Now let's talk again about the epistle. Paul is imprisoned. He's very clear about that in this letter. And there's every reason to believe that he's imprisoned in Rome. A handful of specific reasons. One of which is that in the closing of the letter in chapter 4, Paul makes mention that those of Caesar's household especially greet the brethren in Philippi. Pretty hard to encounter Caesar's household outside of Rome, isn't it? Not only that, in chapter 1, Paul mentions in verse 13 that his particular situation is known throughout the Praetorian Guard. Any history buffs in here? Who are the Praetorian Guard? Say it loud, I'm deaf.
Protected Caesar.
Yeah, they were Caesar's personal security detail, sort of like Secret Service today. Okay, so these would have been the palace guards in and around the Caesar's palace. Okay? They know about Paul's situation. Paul expects deliverance. In fact, he says so in so many words in chapter 1, verse 19, verses 21 through 26, and again in chapter 2 and verse 24. He expects to be delivered, although he's prepared to die if he needs to. Now, what do we know about that first Roman imprisonment? Well, obviously there was a second, or I wouldn't have called it the first, right? Paul doesn't die during the first Roman imprisonment. He's released. Now, Luke doesn't record that for us. The book of Acts ends when Paul arrives in Rome the first time, right? Chapter 28. However, from Paul's letters, we can pick up some later history, which tells us essentially that Paul was released from that first imprisonment. He did some more preaching and wound up back in Rome. We don't know exactly the story of how he wound up back in Rome, but that's where he ends up dying. Okay? About 67 or so. But at this point, Paul believes he's going to be released, and he's right. He is going to be released. He makes mention a couple of times in the letter that the Philippians are facing opposition. He also, by the way, mentions that in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We always think about those first 5 verses of 2 Corinthians 8 of talking about generosity. And they're great verses for talking about generosity, but there's a few little other clues in there. Remember, Paul's writing to the Corinthians who are quite wealthy, and he's trying to get them to do what they pledged they would do, to give to this collection he's taking up for the saints in Judea. And in chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians, he reminds them of the story of the Macedonian Christians. He doesn't specify Philippi exactly, but Macedonia is a province of which Philippi is a part. And he mentions two things. He mentions that they are in great affliction and that they are in deep poverty. And despite both of these things, they not only took part in this giving, but they did more than what Paul wanted them to do. Paul intimates that they begged to be able to give and that they gave beyond what they were really able to give. Now that's interesting to me because that tells me, first of all, we have a very rich city, but we have poor, persecuted Christians. And that's interesting to me, especially in a city where there is a notable absence of Jews. Because in most of the cities in Paul's lifetime, when the Christians are getting grief, they're getting it from the Jews who are wanting to get rid of Christianity because they see it as a deviation from the law of Moses. But there aren't a significant population of Jews in Philippi. And so if they're being persecuted by people primarily of a Roman character. Again, there's a story that I'd like to know more about there. But they were persecuted, and yet in their persecution they are deeply generous, having not only taken part in the collection for the saints, but having sent three total contributions to Paul. The two that they sent in Thessalonica, and then the one that they sent by Epaphroditus that Paul is writing the letter back to them in response to. As a matter of fact, as best we can tell, it's Epaphroditus who ends up carrying that letter back to the Philippians, and Timothy, Paul intends to send shortly thereafter to help build them up. Okay, so they're generous, they're persecuted, but there's no indication in the Scripture of the letter to the Philippians that they've compromised the truth. Now that's interesting, because Paul has to do a lot of correcting with the Corinthians, for example, in their doctrinal positions. He has to do a lot of instructing and correcting with the Thessalonians in some of their doctrinal misunderstandings. He doesn't seem, the Galatians, same thing. He doesn't seem to have to correct any misunderstandings, misapprehensions, or departures from the truth among the Philippians. There are a lot of words of encouragement to remain true, but there's no indication that they've left the truth or that he's trying to get them back to the truth. The one indication of trouble that exists in the whole letter is in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, where he calls out two women by name, Euodia and Syntyche, and he urges them, and this is all he says about this, he urges them to be faithful to the Lord, and he asks the brethren at Philippi to help them be faithful to the Lord. Now, you could read that two or three different ways. Some of the commentators have concluded that Euodia and Syntyche were having an argument, and Paul's telling them basically, get over it and do right, and telling the church to help them to straighten it out. That's a possibility. It may also be possible that these two had been targeted for special persecution, and Paul is sending them these words of encouragement, remain faithful to the Lord, and urging the church to build them up in their persecution. Just food for thought. But the church overall is very, very much complimented throughout the entire letter. Now, here's another thing. We almost always remark when we talk about the letter to the Philippians that Paul is writing this letter from Roman prison. No question there. And we also almost always comment that the theme of the letter is joy. No question there. The word for rejoice occurs all throughout the book. Have you ever thought about the fact that Paul may have chosen to do that not as much as a reflection of his own disposition as an encouragement to the suffering Philippians to maintain their joyful disposition. In other words, as a leader, what is the best way to build up the morale of people you're leading? You set the tone yourself, right? I mean, if I walk into a room of people who are looking to me as a leader, and I'm down in the mouth and down in the dumps, and I'm, pessimistic about everything, how long is it going to take for that group of people to become down in the mouth and down in the dumps and pessimistic about everything? Not very long. But if I walk in there with a can-do attitude and we're going to conquer this, and okay, we've got this issue to work out, how can we overcome this versus what are we going to do about this? You see the difference? People will feed off of the attitudes of their leaders. And I would suggest that maybe we read the letter to the Philippians not only marveling at the joy in the letter, but thinking about that joy as being on display intentionally by Paul to try to embolden and encourage the Philippians who are suffering too, and potentially suffering at the hands of some of the same kind of folks Paul is suffering at. Romans, in other words. It's a beautiful, beautiful letter. Now, when we think about it, Paul says some of the most deeply personal things about his history in this letter. Remember, this is where he lays out his old Jewish resume. Talks about how he was circumcised on the 8th day of the tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Pharisee, and all of those sorts of things. He didn't say this to anybody else. And there's a general tone of closeness and confidentiality, sort of, between Paul and this church that just isn't in some of his other letters. Not that he didn't love those other churches. I mean, his love for the Ephesians is obvious in that letter. But there are some people that you can just sort of speak your mind to and not worry about being misunderstood or what have you. And it seems that Paul shared that relationship with the Philippian brethren. And he sort of tells them what he's thinking in more mature terms and doesn't deal with them. He told the Corinthians point blank that he was dealing with them like children because they were children and they needed to grow up. He never says anything like that to the Philippians. Okay? Very deeply personal. But also, look at this. Look at verse 4. Look at the tenderness and the affection, chapter 4 rather, the tenderness and affection that we find here. Therefore, my beloved brothers and sisters, whom I long to see, my joy and crown. Well, that's beautiful, isn't it? Not only brothers and sisters, but beloved brothers and sisters, and incidentally, that's a form of the word agape, whom I long to see. He's visited them at least as much as he's visited anybody else, but he wants to see them again. Now, he point blank told the Corinthians that he was dreading coming to see them at one point. Remember that? He doesn't say that to the Philippians. I long to see you. And not only that, my joy and crown. He is proud of these people. He's proud of the character that they've exhibited. He's proud of the way that they've stood up to persecution. He's proud of the fact that they've not abandoned the faith despite not having had a lot of time to be grounded in the faith. And he's proud of the way that they exemplified generosity and faithfulness in suffering. And he can use them as an example to other churches that could stand to learn from their example. And then he launches into some of these specific things about Euodia and Syntyche to live in harmony with the Lord. He says, indeed, my true companion, not sure who he's referring to there, maybe the church as a whole. I ask you also, help these women who've shared my struggle in the cause of the gospel, together with Clement, as well as the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Just beautiful, personal, affectionate writing to a church that just stands the test of time. Wish we had more time to talk about it, but thank you so much for your attention.